On the morning of 18th of June, 1896, in the East Library of the Vanderbilt Triple Palace at First West 57th Street, New York, the ink on the blotter was drying faster than the tears in Alice Vanderbilt's eyes. Outside, carriage wheels grind against the granite curb. Inside, the matriarch of America's railroad dynasty bends over a sheet of heavy cream notepaper stamped with the family crest. The date is no accident. It is the very day her son Cornelius Neely Vanderbilt III was meant to marry Grace Graham Wilson, youngest of the so-called marrying Wilsons. Society gossip columns have already linked their names for months, charting their appearances in Newport and at the opera. Alice pauses, folds the letter once, then again, aligning the monogram with meticulous care before sealing it in wax. A mother's note, a legal instruction, a social ultimatum. On paper, they look the same. Some inherit fortunes, others inherit decisions that have already been written for them. In late autumn 1880, at the Vanderbilt Mansion on Fifth Avenue and 52nd Street, 7-year-old Cornelius Vanderbilt III, called Neely by family, walks the length of the great picture gallery with his governess, their footsteps muffled by Turkish carpets that cost more than most houses. The portraits begin with the steely gaze of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, founder of the dynasty, then sweep through ship lines and railroad empires, married daughters in satin and pearls, and the stern visages of men who built America's transportation infrastructure through ruthless competition and strategic vision. The governess, a woman whose name does not survive in family records, but whose presence appears in household accounts as a regular salary expense, pauses before each portrait to provide brief biographies. She tells the child, very simply and without sentiment, that one day much of this will be his: the houses, the railroads, the responsibility of maintaining the Vanderbilt name and fortune. The lesson is delivered not with excitement but with the gravity appropriate to discussing inheritance among the wealthy, where property and obligation are inseparable. The Vanderbilt Triple Palace at 645th Avenue, as contemporary descriptions and estate inventories document, is organized like a visible hierarchy. Public salons facing Fifth Avenue for entertaining and display. Family rooms tucked deeper within the massive structure for private life, and servants' corridors running through unseen spaces where the machinery of domestic labor operates invisibly. The architecture itself teaches a lesson that young Neely absorbs without conscious awareness. Display in front, obedience behind, everything in its proper place according to function and rank. His father, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, eldest son of William Henry Vanderbilt and grandson of the Commodore, approaches fatherhood with the same systematic attention he brings to railroad management. In family letters preserved in later biographies and archival collections, he emphasizes responsibility and duty more than affection when discussing his eldest surviving son. The words are formal, almost contractual, as if the child himself is a kind of living document that must be properly executed and maintained. Neely's older brother William had died young, making Neely the effective heir despite being the second son. This shift in succession brings additional weight to his upbringing. He's now the boy who must be prepared to carry the family name forward, to manage vast enterprises, to marry appropriately, and produce heirs who will extend the Vanderbilt line into future generations. The pressure, though never explicitly articulated as a burden, is nonetheless omnipresent in every lesson, every correction, every reminder of what is expected. The narrator observes that privilege in the Vanderbilt household is not softness or indulgence. It is a schedule maintained by governesses and tutors, a staircase of ascending expectations, a succession plan that exists before the child is old enough to understand what succession means. The boy who is told he will inherit everything is already moving through rooms designed to measure how well he obeys, how thoroughly he absorbs the lessons of his class and family, and how completely he can be shaped into the heir his father requires. By August 1885, the rhythm of Neely's world had been firmly established through the annual migration between New York and Newport, Rhode Island. Winters are spent at the Triple Palace in Manhattan, where the family participates in the opera season, hosts dinners for railroad executives and political allies, and maintains the social machinery that sustains upper-class life. Summers bring retreat to the breakers in Newport, where sea air and relative informality, relative only by Vanderbilt standards, provide respite from Manhattan's heat while maintaining the intensive social schedule that defines the summer season. The first breakers, the house Neely knew in his childhood, is a wooden villa built in 1878, elegant but not yet the massive stone palace that will rise after a devastating fire in 1892 destroys the original structure. Photographs from this period show a rambling frame house with wide verandas surrounded by manicured lawns that slope toward the Atlantic. Children appear in the background of some images, small figures in white clothing, their faces often blurred by the long exposure, times required by early photography. Household ledgers and account books, preserved in Vanderbilt family papers and institutional archives, document the infrastructure of Neely's education, regular payments to tutors for French and German, fees for riding instruction at Newport stables, compensation for music masters who teach piano and appreciation of classical composition. The education is comprehensive and expensive, designed to produce a young man who can move comfortably in international society, discuss literature and art with European aristocrats, and demonstrate the cultural sophistication expected of someone bearing the Vanderbilt name. Mornings at the Breakers begin with lessons conducted in one of the house's quieter rooms, away from the social activity that dominates afternoons and evenings. Neely studies languages, mathematics, history, and the classics, subjects considered essential for a gentleman's education. Afternoons bring supervised tennis on the clipped lawns, sailing excursions in Narragansett Bay, and the formal teas where even children are expected to practice the conversation and manners that will serve them in adult social life. At the long dining table, whether in New York or Newport, Alice Vanderbilt presides with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. She determines the seating arrangements according to complex calculations of rank, family relationship, and social objective. Relatives and guests are positioned to facilitate particular conversations, to honor certain visitors, to subtly communicate hierarchy through physical placement. Children observe these arrangements, learning without explicit instruction how social power operates through seemingly trivial decisions about who sits where. While other boys Neely's age might scribble informal letters home from school or camp, Neely watches his mother compose formal correspondence. Notes of thanks for hospitality received, carefully worded apologies for invitations that must be declined, gracious acceptances that acknowledge social obligations. The ritual of folded monogram stationery becomes his first lesson in how power travels in his world, how relationships are maintained and obligations discharged through written communication that follows elaborate protocols of form and content. The narrator reflects that, to grow up, Vanderbilt is to learn that even kindness is formalized, sent by post on expensive paper, and recorded in ledgers that track social obligations as carefully as financial accounts. The warmth that might exist in less stratified families must pass through layers of protocol and performance before it can be expressed, if it can be expressed at all. In such a world, one unwelcome name on an envelope, one letter that violates family expectations, will one day have the power to rewrite a fortune. In May 1893, at St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire, the adolescent Neely receives a neatly folded letter from his father, delivered by the school's mail service and bearing the familiar Vanderbilt crest on its heavy envelope. St. Paul's, an elite Episcopal boarding school founded in 1856, serves as the standard preparatory institution for wealthy families preparing sons for Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. School records confirm Neely's enrollment and satisfactory academic progress. Biographical accounts note that the Commodore's great-grandson is being groomed along the carefully mapped path typical of his class: prep school, then Yale, then gradual assumption of responsibilities within the family's railroad and financial enterprises. The letter, formal in tone despite the family relationship, praises Neely's recent exam results while reminding him of the honor of the name and the expectations that come with bearing it. There is nothing unusual in such phrasing for the period. Late 19th century fathers, particularly those of the upper classes, often communicated with their sons in language that emphasized duty, character, and family reputation rather than emotional warmth or personal interest. But the effect of such letters repeated over years and internalized through adolescence is quiet and cumulative, building a sense of obligation that becomes inseparable from self-conception. The family has recently experienced tragedy that makes these paternal letters more weighted with significance. Neely's older brother, William, who had been at Yale, died unexpectedly, leaving Neely as the clear heir to his father's position and fortune. Newspapers reported the death with the mixture of sympathy and fascination that the press typically brings to wealthy families' private sorrows. At family dinners back in New York during school holidays, conversations about railroad operations, investment strategies, and business decisions no longer skip over the second son as they might have when an older brother was expected to inherit leadership. They rest squarely on Neely, measuring his understanding and preparing him for future responsibilities. The pressure is never articulated as pressure. To acknowledge it directly would be to suggest weakness, to imply that bearing the family burden might be difficult rather than a natural privilege. But Neely feels it nonetheless in the way conversations pause when he enters rooms where business is being discussed, in the way his father watches him during social events to assess how well he performs expected courtesies, in the way his academic progress is reviewed not merely for intellectual achievement, but for evidence of discipline and reliability. Contemporary accounts and later biographical work describe Neely during these years as intelligent but somewhat rebellious, drawn more to engineering and mechanical innovation than to the financial and social management his father envisions for him. He is fascinated by locomotives and patents, by the technical problems of moving freight efficiently, by the physics of steam engines and track engineering. Interests that align with the family's railroad empire, but in ways more hands-on and less corporate than his father prefers. The narrator observes that in a society that records everything, from examination marks to charity ball attendance, from business correspondence to calling card exchanges, expectation hardens into documentary evidence long before a life is fully lived. Neely exists in a web of paper: school records, family letters, social columns, financial projections that assume his future role. The documentation creates a kind of gravity, pulling him toward predetermined outcomes even as his own interests and desires begin to diverge from family plans. And just as these records settle into place, creating an official version of who Cornelius Vanderbilt III is meant to become, another name begins appearing beside his in the society columns that chronicle Newport summers and New York opera seasons. Grace Graham Wilson, youngest daughter of a banking family whose social ambitions match their recently acquired wealth, a woman whose presence in Neely's life will ultimately force a choice between the predetermined path and something his parents have never prepared him for: the possibility of choosing his own future. On a cold evening in January 1894, at 500 Lynn Fifth Avenue, the former residence of Boss Tweed, now transformed by new money into a respectable mansion occupied by the Wilson family, music drifts from the drawing room, where Grace Graham Wilson, age 23, presides over an informal gathering of young society members. She wears a pale gown in the current fashion, her dark hair arranged in the Gibson girl style that defines feminine beauty in the 1890s. Society notices in New York. Newspapers record her as a frequent hostess and guest at the dinners, teas, and musicals that structure upper-class social life. Her family's parties increasingly intertwined with established New York families as the Wilsons execute their careful campaign for social acceptance. The Wilson family, patriarch Richard Thornton Wilson, made his fortune in banking and finance, with rumored Civil War profiteering adding a taint that older families have not forgotten, has become notorious for the marital success of its children. Society wags have dubbed them the Marrying Wilsons, after a series of advantageous matches that saw Wilson daughters marry into old New York and European aristocracy. May Wilson married the wealthy Ogden Goulet. Belle married Sir Michael Herbert, a British diplomat. Orme Wilson married Carolyn Astor, daughter of the Mrs. Astor. The pattern is clear and strategic. Each marriage elevates the family's position, trades Wilson money for older names and better social access. Grace, the youngest daughter, has been thoroughly prepared for her role in this family enterprise. Her education includes European travels that provided polish and cultural sophistication, language tutors who ensured fluency in French and adequate German, music instruction that allows her to perform competently at the piano, and most importantly, the subtle training in social navigation that cannot be taught from books. How to listen attentively to powerful men, how to laugh at the right moment without seeming calculating, how to make wealthy potential suitors feel understood and appreciated while never appearing to pursue them openly. These accomplishments are not merely feminine charms practiced for personal appeal. They are social instruments honed by years of careful instruction, tools for advancing family ambition through the only avenue truly available to women of her class: marriage to men whose names and fortunes can elevate those who bear them. The Wilson girls have learned to play Chopin. More importantly, they have learned to play a room, to read social dynamics and position themselves advantageously within them. When Neely first appears in the Wilson drawing room, introduced by mutual friends, drawn by Grace's beauty and intelligence, entering a space where the choreography of courtship has already been carefully designed, he steps into a performance already underway. Grace is practiced at appearing artless while being utterly strategic, at seeming to follow while actually leading, at making her interest appear to be responsive rather than initiating. She engages Neely in conversation about his engineering interests, asks intelligent questions that demonstrate genuine curiosity, listens with apparent fascination to explanations of technical problems that might bore other young women. The narrator observes that in the Gilded Age, some women learned to paint watercolors and embroider pillowcases. Others learned to paint themselves as ideal companions and embroider reality until it matched family ambitions. Grace Wilson has mastered both the conventional accomplishments expected of her sex in class and the more calculating skills required to deploy those accomplishments in service of social ascent. Her performance is so skillful that it may not be entirely performance. The line between strategic interest and genuine attraction can blur even for the person executing the strategy. What begins as polished social performance will soon be read by one vigilant matriarch as a calculated threat. Alice Vanderbilt, watching from her position at the apex of New York society, sees in Grace Wilson not a potential daughter-in-law but a social climber, using her son as a vehicle for Wilson family ambition. Another conquest in a campaign that has already placed Wilson's in some of the best drawing rooms in America and Europe. The recognition will harden into opposition that no amount of charm or courtesy can soften. By June 1895, Neely completed his degree at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, joining the ranks of young men from wealthy families who attend prestigious universities, more for social credentialing and useful connections than for intellectual development or professional preparation. College records confirm his graduation. Later biographical accounts and family correspondence emphasize his growing fascination with engineering, particularly with improvements to locomotives and railroad freight systems. Interests that align with the family business but in ways more technical and innovative than merely managing inherited enterprises. Yale, in the 1890s, was a less rigorous academic institution than finishing school for the wealthy, a place where sons of industrialists and financiers acquire Polish, form networks that will serve them in business and society, and participate in exclusive social clubs that reinforce class solidarity. Neely joins the appropriate organizations, maintains adequate academic standing, and develops the friendships expected of someone in his position, but his real passion is increasingly directed toward mechanical problems and patent applications, toward understanding how things work and how they might be improved rather than simply profiting from systems others have built. In contrast to this world of male technical education and social networking, the summer seasons in Newport continue to demand participation in an entirely different curriculum. Morning rides along Bellevue Avenue, where young men and women of the upper classes display themselves and their horses. Afternoon calling hours where families receive visitors according to strict protocols, and evenings filled with dinners and music halls where potential matches are evaluated and courtships advance through carefully chaperoned interactions. Diary fragments from Newport residents and press descriptions of summer social life describe a world where schedules are as strict as any school timetable, where spontaneity is suspect and every social gesture carries weight and meaning. Young women appear at specified hours in appropriate dress, accompanied by chaperones who ensure propriety while allowing enough freedom for genuine conversation and connection. Young men make calls at proper times, stay for prescribed durations, and follow complex rules about when interest may be expressed and how courtship may proceed. Grace Wilson moves through these spaces with calculated ease that appears entirely natural. New York Society columns note her presence at Beaulieu, the Goulet cottage now connected to the Wilson family through May Wilson's marriage, and at other prominent Newport residences. Her name appears with increasing frequency beside Neely's in the casual mentions that fill newspaper society pages. Among those present were lists that seem merely informative, but that astute readers understand as documentary evidence of developing attachments, of couples being seen together often enough to suggest serious interest. Each shared appearance is both genuine social interaction and a small act of defiance against Neely's parents' wishes, which have become increasingly clear as the relationship develops. The Vanderbilts do not forbid the connection explicitly. Such direct confrontation would be crude beneath their dignity, but they communicate disapproval through cooler receptions when Grace is mentioned, through pointed invitations to events where other young women of more acceptable families are prominently featured, through the thousand subtle signals by which upper-class families express preference and opposition without descending to open conflict. The narrator reflects that while Neely studies the mechanics of steel and steam at Yale, learning to calculate forces and tolerances with mathematical precision, Grace practices the subtler physics of social status, understanding how proximity creates assumption, how repetition builds expectation, how rumor and newsprint can bend even the firmest parental resolve by making a match seem inevitable before it is formally acknowledged. She knows that in their world, what appears in society columns acquires a kind of reality that private preferences cannot entirely resist. That being seen together publicly creates social facts that families must then negotiate rather than simply decree. The education Neely receives at Yale prepares him to manage railroads. The education Grace has received prepares her to manage the social machinery that determines who may marry whom and on what terms. When these two forms of training meet in the context of mutual attraction, the result can be either perfect alliance or perfect scandal, depending entirely on whether the families whose approval matters choose to bless or oppose the union. In early 1896, society gossip columns from New York and Newport began to speculate more openly about an impending engagement between Cornelius Vanderbilt III and Grace Graham Wilson. The speculation is carefully worded. Journalists of the period understood the legal risks of stating romantic attachments too explicitly, but the meaning is clear to anyone literate in the language of society reporting. Phrases like frequently seen together and a match that would unite signal expectations that a formal announcement will soon follow. The match, as society writers frame it, would represent a union of vast railroad wealth with new banking money, a combination that should please both families through the classic Gilded Age calculus of strategic alliance. The Vanderbilts would gain connection to the Wilson banking relationships and European social contacts developed through earlier Wilson marriages. The Wilsons would secure the ultimate prize, marriage into America's most famous industrial dynasty, validation that would complete their transformation from Civil War-era strivers to fully accepted members of the social elite. But at first, West 57th Street, in the private family rooms of the Vanderbilt Triple Palace, the response to these speculations is silence that speaks more powerfully than any public statement. Biographical accounts and later memoirs, including some family correspondence that has survived in archives, recall how Cornelius Vanderbilt II and Alice Vanderbilt respond to their son's attachment. They refuse to receive Grace Wilson, declining to issue invitations that would bring her into their home, making clear through absence that she is not welcome, even as invitations to other events continue to arrive for the Wilsons from less particular families. The exclusion is not total prohibition, the Vanderbilts cannot prevent their adult son from socializing where he chooses or forbid other families from inviting Grace to their events. But it is an unmistakable statement of disapproval, a use of domestic space and social access as weapons to communicate family position. The doors of the Vanderbilt houses remain closed to the woman their son wishes to marry, a closure that is both literal and symbolic, architectural enforcement of social hierarchy. Letters between Alice Vanderbilt and trusted confidants, quoted in family histories and biographies of the period, reveal the reasoning behind this opposition, though the language is often coded in the euphemisms required by upper-class correspondence. There are concerns about motives and suitability, about social climbing that threatens to reverse the Vanderbilts' own careful ascent from commercial fortune to social acceptance. References appear to the Wilson fortune's Civil War origins, to rumors of profiteering and speculation that, while possibly no more ethically questionable than Commodore Vanderbilt's business practices, carry a taint of newness and opportunism that older money has learned to disguise. For Alice Vanderbilt particularly, who has worked so meticulously to secure her children's positions among the Knickerbockers and old New York families, this marriage represents movement in the wrong direction. From families whose social acceptance is secure down to families still climbing, still marked by the recent origins of their wealth. That the Wilsons have been successful in placing their daughters suggests not their social arrival, but their continued campaign, their use of marriage as advancement rather than as union of equals already established in their proper spheres. The narrator observes that in a world obsessed with lineage, pedigree, and the intricate hierarchies of who belongs where, love between individuals can appear on paper like hostile takeover, an attempt by one family to capture territory and status through romantic attachment rather than through the proper channels of gradual acceptance over generations. Alice sees in Grace Wilson not a person her son loves, but a strategy being executed, another Wilson marriage that will elevate that family while potentially compromising the Vanderbilt position if it appears they accept unions with the ambitious new rich. The solution the elder Vanderbilts choose will not be persuasion or open confrontation, both of which might fail or create public scandal. It will be paperwork, the quiet rewriting of inheritance documents that can communicate more powerfully than any argument what the cost of disobedience will be. In their world, love must compete not with parental disapproval expressed through tears or anger, but with legal instruments that can redistribute millions of dollars and the social power those millions represent, that can effectively disinherit without completely disowning, that can punish while maintaining plausible deniability about the punishment's cause. On 18th of June 1896, the day that society gossips have whispered might see the formal announcement of Neely's engagement to Grace Wilson, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, instead signs a new will in his New York offices, surrounded by lawyers who will ensure that the document is legally impeccable. The will's probate after his death 3 years later will reveal its terms. His second son, Alfred Gwynn Vanderbilt, will inherit the bulk of an estate valued at nearly $73 million, while Neely's share is reduced to a fraction of what the eldest surviving son might normally expect. The reduction is substantial, but not total. Neely will still receive income from trust funds that make him wealthy by any normal standard, and still retain access to some family properties and resources. But the symbolic message is devastating. He is being demoted in the family hierarchy, his younger brother elevated over him, the normal order of primogeniture disrupted as punishment for romantic disobedience. The Congressional Gold Medal that symbolizes headship of the Vanderbilt family, a tangible marker of succession, will pass not to Neely, but to Alfred. The legal document, filed with appropriate witnesses and legal formalities, does not mention Grace Wilson by name. It does not need to. In the interconnected world of New York high society, where gossip travels faster than telegrams, and where the timing of significant actions is always noted and interpreted, everyone understands what the new will signifies. The date, 18th of June, the rumored engagement date, transforms what might have been private family settlement into public warning. Marry against our wishes, and the architecture of inheritance will root around you, will flow to more obedient children, and will use money as a weapon to enforce compliance. At home, in the private family quarters of the Triple Palace, Alice Vanderbilt continues her habitual letter writing, sitting at her desk in the morning light that filters through lace curtains, her pen moving across cream-colored stationery with the smooth confidence of decades of practice. She writes to relatives and allies who share her concern about Neely's attachment, carefully worded notes that never state opposition openly but that create networks of understanding and mutual support. The same graceful script that dispatches opera invitations and charitable solicitations now carries the outline of a family campaign to isolate and discourage, to make clear that marriage to Grace Wilson will mean social and financial consequences Neely must seriously consider. The letters are not cruel. Alice would never descend to crude threats or emotional manipulation of the sort that might be visible and vulgar. They are precise, controlled, strategic communications that use all the tools of upper-class correspondence: sympathy carefully deployed, concern expressed with apparent reluctance, questions posed that suggest answers without stating them directly. She writes that she hopes Neely will reconsider, that she trusts his judgment will prevail over temporary infatuation, that she knows he understands his responsibilities to family and name. The narrator observes that in the Gilded Age, rebellion against parental authority is met not with raised voices or dramatic confrontations. Such displays would be beneath the dignity of families like the Vanderbilts, but with revised legal documents that speak in the cold language of millions of dollars in inheritance structures. The will becomes a quiet threat, financial architecture that can be redrawn to exclude or diminish those who displease, power exercised through lawyers and trust instruments rather than through open conflict. Yet paperwork cuts both ways in a society governed by documentation and legal formality. Just weeks after Cornelius Vanderbilt II signs his new will, disinheriting his eldest son in all but name, another legal document will make the threat irreversible and the opposition futile: a marriage certificate that will join Neely and Grace regardless of parental blessing, that will create facts no will can undo even if it can punish them, that will transform private family dispute into public scandal that newspapers will cover with mixture of sympathy and fascination. On 4th August 1896, newspapers from New York to Indianapolis and beyond reported that Cornelius Vanderbilt III had married Grace Graham Wilson in a quiet ceremony at her family's residence at 511 Fifth Avenue. The wedding, conducted with minimal publicity and none of the elaborate celebration expected for a Vanderbilt union, represents both romantic triumph and social rupture, the fulfillment of the couple's wishes, and the formalization of family breach that the new will had threatened. The ceremony itself is intimate by Gilded Age standards. No massive guest list of the 400, no elaborate floral arrangements filling a church, no multi-course wedding breakfast for hundreds of society figures. Instead, family members and close friends of the Wilsons gather in the drawing room where Neely and Grace first met, where their courtship developed under watchful eyes, where the decision to marry despite Vanderbilt opposition was likely finalized in quiet conversations. Contemporary society columns note the absence of the groom's parents with carefully neutral language that nonetheless makes the absence speak volumes about family division. The marriage announcement appears in newspapers alongside other society news, but the coverage carries undercurrents of scandal and speculation. Journalists, constrained by the libel laws and social conventions that prevent explicit discussion of family conflicts among the wealthy, nonetheless convey through careful phrasing and significant silences that this union is not blessed by the Vanderbilt parents, that the young couple has chosen affection over filial obedience, that there will be consequences for this choice even as the legal fact of marriage is accomplished. Society columnists note the breach with almost clinical fascination. Their coverage, treating the Vanderbilt family conflict as a public drama worthy of detailed documentation and interpretation. The morning newspapers that carry the announcement are clipped and pasted into scrapbooks that still survive in archives. Thick volumes of pressed newsprint, the paper browned by age, but the scandal still legible, still capable of conveying the shock that one of America's wealthiest heirs would marry against explicit parental wishes and forfeit inheritance rather than surrender the woman he loves. That evening, in rented rooms far from the Triple Palace and the family houses that Neely might once have expected to inherit, Grace sits at a borrowed desk to write her first thank you notes as Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt III. The task is familiar. She has been writing such notes for years, acknowledging gifts and hospitality, maintaining the social connections that define upper class life. But the context has changed dramatically. The stationery is still Wilson, not Vanderbilt. She has not yet had new paper printed with her married name and monogram. The ritual, however, remains the same: gracious acknowledgement of wedding gifts, carefully worded expressions of gratitude, the maintenance of social bonds through controlled, elegant written communication. Her handwriting is steady, the script flowing with the confidence of someone who has practiced this skill since childhood. There is no visible sign of the dramatic rupture she and Neely have caused, no hint in the perfectly formed letters and conventional phrases that this marriage has cost her husband millions of dollars and his parents' blessing. The notes themselves are ordinary documents of social courtesy, but their existence marks extraordinary circumstances. A wedding celebrated despite opposition, a marriage begun in defiance rather than family joy. The narrator reflects that two pens are moving now in different parts of New York. Alice Vanderbilt's writing letters that attempt to manage the social fallout of her son's disobedience, and Grace Wilson Vanderbilt's writing notes that assert her new identity and claim her place as member of the Vanderbilt family, regardless of whether that family acknowledges her. Between these two instruments of written communication lies the entire conflict: duty against desire, family authority against individual choice, the power of wealth and inheritance against the power of legally accomplished fact. When Cornelius Vanderbilt II dies 3 years later, the full price of Neely's choice will be read aloud in a lawyer's office as the will's terms become public. But the fundamental transaction has already occurred on this August day in 1896. Inheritance exchanged for autonomy, family wealth traded for the freedom to choose one's own spouse, the careful architecture of Vanderbilt succession disrupted by the simple legal fact of a marriage certificate that no parental will can erase. After Cornelius Vanderbilt II's death on 12th of September 1899, following a stroke suffered at his residence, the terms of his will became public through the probate process required for such massive estates. Newspapers across the country report the details with the mixture of deference and fascination that the press brings to extremely wealthy families' financial arrangements. The estate is appraised at nearly $73 million, an almost incomprehensible sum representing railroads, real estate, stocks, bonds, and other holdings accumulated across 3 generations of Vanderbilt wealth. The distribution of this fortune confirms what the family has known privately since 1896. The largest share, over half the estate, passes to Alfred Gwynn Vanderbilt, the younger son elevated to heir because of his older brother's disobedience. Neely receives approximately $1.5 million outright plus trust income, substantial wealth that would make him rich by any normal measure, but a fraction of what he might have inherited as the eldest surviving son under traditional primogeniture if he had married according to his parents' wishes. The disinheritance is not total, not the complete cutting off that more vindictive parents might have executed. The elder Vanderbilts have calibrated their punishment carefully, enough money to prevent claims of complete abandonment, enough to allow Neely to live comfortably, but not enough to give him the position and power he would have wielded as principal heir to the Vanderbilt fortune. The Congressional Gold Medal symbolizing the headship of the family, a tangible object that represents succession and primacy, passes to Alfred rather than to Neely, making the displacement official and permanent. In private, family members and close friends note that Alfred himself is uncomfortable with the situation, recognizing that he has benefited from his brother's punishment and that the distribution violates traditional norms of inheritance. Later accounts suggest Alfred provides additional financial assistance to Neely beyond what the will requires, softening through private generosity what the legal document harshly imposed. But the public record remains. Cornelius Vanderbilt II chose to redirect his fortune away from his eldest son, to use inheritance as a weapon against romantic disobedience, to enforce through money what he could not enforce through persuasion. For Grace, now fully Grace Graham Wilson Vanderbilt, the will's terms represent vindication of a sort. Her husband chose her, despite knowing the financial cost, despite explicit threats communicated through legal documents and social exclusion. But they also represent a permanent reminder that her presence in Neely's life cost him tens of millions of dollars, that his family viewed her as a threat rather than as a daughter, that she will never have the relationship with her husband's family that she might have imagined when she married. In the drawing room of their residence, Grace continues her habitual practice of letter writing, maintaining social connections through correspondence even as her position in New York society has shifted from Wilson daughter to Vanderbilt wife. But a Vanderbilt wife whose relationship with the main branch of the family remains cold, whose invitations to certain events are notably absent, whose social power derives from her husband's name but not from his family's full acceptance. Family members recall her determination during this period that their new life would not be defined entirely by what had been withheld, that they would create their own sphere of influence and respect, rather than simply mourning exclusion from the inheritance Neely might have received. The narrator observes that power in such families rarely announces itself through dramatic gestures or explicit confrontations. It operates through subtle mechanisms: who receives invitations to which events, whose names appear on charitable committees, whose opinions carry weight in business decisions, and, most fundamentally, who controls the capital that makes all other forms of social power possible. The will has changed these calculations decisively, moving Neely from the center of Vanderbilt power to its periphery, from presumptive family head to dependent relative who must negotiate for assistance rather than direct vast enterprises as his birthright. Excluded from the railroad boardrooms and the family councils where major decisions are made, where the Vanderbilt fortune is managed and deployed, Neely turns his attention increasingly to the arenas his father cannot fully control through inheritance. The world of engineering and mechanical innovation where patents and technical expertise matter more than family position, and eventually the military where rank is earned through service rather than inherited through birth. These spheres offer alternative sources of identity and achievement, ways to build reputation independent of the family fortune he has largely forfeited for love. By 1903, newspaper coverage of Cornelius Vanderbilt III increasingly emphasizes not his position as railroad heir, but his growing reputation as engineer and inventor. Patent records from this period document numerous applications for improvements to locomotives and freight cars, technical innovations that demonstrate genuine expertise rather than merely trading on the family name. The patents bring some income through licensing fees and royalties, but more importantly, they establish Neely's identity as someone contributing to the railroad industry through innovation, rather than simply inheriting and managing existing enterprises. The couple's social life has necessarily shifted from the pattern it might have followed if Neely had inherited as expected. Rather than presiding over the Triple Palace or the Breakers, establishing themselves as leaders of New York and Newport society, they create alternative social bases. In Newport, they rent Beaulieu, the substantial cottage that once belonged to the Gaulet family and that remains connected to the Wilsons through earlier family marriages. The house, while impressive by ordinary standards, occupies a different tier from the massive palaces of the Vanderbilt and Astor families, marking both their continued participation in Newport society and their somewhat diminished position within it. Society columns and social registers from these years document their activities: teas and music halls hosted at Beaulieu, coaching parties along Ocean Drive, dinners attended at other Newport cottages. The coverage describes Grace as impeccably attired and notes the couple's active social calendar, their continued presence in the networks of wealth and status that define their class. But careful readers can detect subtle differences from the coverage given to families at the very apex of society: slightly less prominent placement, slightly less detailed description, the quiet but unmistakable marking of position through journalistic nuance. Financially, the reduced inheritance is supplemented by Neely's patent royalties, and eventually by the assistance from Alfred that family accounts and later biographies document. The brothers maintain a relationship despite their father's will having pitted them against each other through unequal inheritance. Alfred, uncomfortable with having benefited from his brother's disobedience, and perhaps guilty about the massive fortune that came to him through accident of being the obedient son, provides money and support that helps maintain Neely and Grace in the lifestyle expected of people bearing the Vanderbilt name. But if the financial arrangements allow continued comfort, the emotional breach remains largely unhealed during these years. Family portraits commissioned for the various Vanderbilt houses do not add Grace's image. Alice Vanderbilt's invitations to family gatherings often fail to arrive for her eldest son and his wife. The exclusion is never total. Complete estrangement would create scandal that might damage the family's position, but it is persistent enough to communicate continued disapproval, to mark Neely's choice as unforgivable, even if it must be accommodated in practical terms. Each morning at a desk overlooking the Atlantic from Beaulieu's windows, Grace drafts invitations on stationery now properly engraved with her married name and monogram, C and G Vanderbilt. The paper is heavy, expensive, correct in every detail of format and quality. The ritual of correspondence continues. The maintenance of social connections through written communication, the careful documentation of who owes what courtesies to whom. She is slowly constructing what might be called a rival court, not in direct opposition to the main Vanderbilt family, but as an alternative center of social activity, proving through successful entertaining and maintained connections that exclusion from the primary inheritance does not require exclusion from society itself. The narrator reflects that disinheritance can remove capital and the specific forms of power that vast fortunes enable, but it cannot erase the skills, discipline, and social knowledge that Grace and Neely both possess. Those capabilities must be managed differently, redirected toward alternative sources of influence and status, repurposed from the context of leading the Vanderbilt dynasty to the different project of maintaining position despite having been pushed to its margins. The work is harder, the foundation less secure, but it is possible for people with their resources and training to create meaningful lives, even within the constraints their choices have imposed. When tragedy strikes the favored son in 1915, when Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt dies in circumstances that will shock the nation and transform public understanding of the war beginning to engulf Europe, the moral geometry of Cornelius Vanderbilt II's will begins to look different. The brother who is given everything will lose everything, including life itself, while the brother who was disinherited for marrying for love will survive to build a different but genuine legacy. On 7 May 1915, the RMS Lusitania, a British ocean liner sailing from New York to Liverpool, was torpedoed by a German submarine off the coast of Ireland. Among the 198 people who die in the sinking is Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, the younger brother who inherited the bulk of the Vanderbilt fortune when their father's will redirected inheritance away from the disobedient older son. The tragedy is reported worldwide as one of the war's most shocking incidents of civilian casualties, and Alfred's death particularly captures public attention as a symbol of how even vast wealth provides no protection against the violence of modern warfare. In New York, newspaper headlines carry both the immediate horror of the sinking and subtle undertones of dramatic irony that must have been painfully obvious to anyone familiar with the Vanderbilt family history. The brother who received tens of millions of dollars, who was elevated to family leadership as reward for obedience and perhaps as punishment for his brother's defiance, is gone at 37, leaving behind widow Margaret Emerson Vanderbilt, young children, and complicated estate that will require years to settle. Neely, the disinherited heir who chose love over fortune, survives, alive to watch his younger brother mourned as family head, alive to recognize that all the money their father redirected could not purchase safety at sea or additional years of life. Letters and diary entries from this period, quoted selectively in family histories and biographies, suggest complex reactions among the surviving Vanderbilts. There is genuine grief. Alfred was loved by his family, including by the brother whose inheritance he received. There is shock at the manner of death, the violence and terror of drowning in the Atlantic as a great ship goes down. But there must also be, though it is never stated explicitly in the preserved documents, recognition that the rigid structure imposed by Cornelius Vanderbilt II's will has been shaken by forces no patriarch could control through legal instruments or financial leverage. For Grace, the tragedy brings no sense of triumph. She is not cruel enough to see vindication in her brother-in-law's death, not capable of viewing the sinking as some form of cosmic justice for the family's treatment of her marriage, but it does represent a stark reminder that the calculations that dominate Gilded Age family life, the careful weighing of financial advantage against romantic preference, of inheritance against affection, ultimately mean nothing when confronted with randomness and mortality. Even vast fortunes cannot purchase immunity from the accidents that end lives, from the German torpedoes that make no distinction between those who inherited appropriately and those who married for love. The Lusitania's sinking also catalyzes shifts in family relationships that have been frozen by pride and resentment since 1896. Some relatives who had maintained distance from Neely and Grace, who had honored Alice Vanderbilt's implicit wishes by treating the couple coolly, began to soften their positions. Money can be redistributed through new wills and settlements. A life, once lost, cannot be recovered. The disinheritance that seemed like permanent punishment begins to look like temporary redistribution of wealth that has now been disrupted by death, creating possibilities for reconciliation and rearrangement that did not exist when Alfred was alive, to embody the alternative succession his father had chosen. The narrator observes that, in dynasties built on meticulous calculation, on strategic marriages, and carefully structured inheritances, on the belief that money and planning can control outcomes across generations, chance remains the one guest no amount of wealth can exclude or manage. The best lawyers cannot draft provisions against torpedoes. The most carefully constructed wills cannot prevent younger sons from dying before older ones, and cannot guarantee that the family structure imagined by one generation will survive intact to the next. As Europe descends further into total war, as the conflict that killed Alfred spreads and intensifies, Neely will take on a new role that has nothing to do with inheritance or family position. He will volunteer for military service, will rise through ranks based on competence and technical knowledge rather than family connections, will eventually achieve the rank of brigadier general and serve in France. The family name will go to the front lines, but in service rather than as marker of privilege, worn by someone who has learned through painful experience that identity based solely on inherited wealth is fragile, subject to revision through parental disapproval or random catastrophe, while identity built through one's own choices and achievements, however costly those choices may be, belongs more securely to the person who created it. By 1918, Cornelius Vanderbilt III had risen to the rank of brigadier general in the United States Army, serving with distinction in France during the final year of the First World War. Military records and later obituaries document his service, emphasizing his technical expertise with locomotives and transportation systems that proves valuable in military logistics, and his leadership qualities that earned him promotion despite entering service relatively late in life and without prior military experience. The achievement represents validation, independent of family fortune, rank earned through competence rather than purchased through wealth, recognition based on what he can do rather than what he inherited or failed to inherit. After the war, Neely and Grace returned to New York and increasingly based themselves at 640 Fifth Avenue, the former mansion of George Washington Vanderbilt, Neely's uncle, who built Biltmore Estate in North Carolina and who died in 1914. The house passes to Neely as eldest son of the eldest son, a provision of George's will that honors traditional primogeniture, even though Cornelius Vanderbilt II's will had disrupted that pattern. The inheritance provides them with a significant Manhattan residence finally worthy of the Vanderbilt name, a house that allows Grace to entertain and establish social presence on par with other wealthy families, even if her relationship with the main Vanderbilt line remains complicated. Grace oversees extensive renovations by architect Horace Trumbauer, transforming the already impressive house into one of New York's most lavish private residences. Contemporary photographs and architectural descriptions document the interiors she creates: a French ballroom with gilt moldings and crystal chandeliers, a music room featuring Parquet de Versailles flooring imported from France, a library where Grace takes afternoon tea among portraits of titled European guests and framed invitations to court presentations. The house becomes her masterwork, an architectural expression of the position she has claimed through determination and strategic social work despite never receiving the full acceptance from Neely's parents that she sought. Every morning in this mansion, Grace continues the ritual that has structured her adult life. Sitting at an escritoire in her private sitting room, she writes letters on heavy cream paper embossed with her monogram. The correspondence flows constantly: invitations to dinners and musicals, thank you notes for gifts and hospitality, letters maintaining the vast network of social connections that define upper class life. Her pen moves with practiced confidence across the expensive stationery. Each letter, a small assertion of her position, each invitation, an exercise of social power, each carefully chosen word contributing to the construction of identity and influence. The Great War has begun to shift the social landscape they inhabit. Many of the massive mansions built during the Gilded Age are becoming difficult to maintain as taxes increase and domestic servants become harder to find and more expensive to employ. Some families are already beginning to close houses, to consolidate from multiple residences to single primary homes, to recognize that the era of unlimited domestic display is ending. But for now, in the early 1920s, Grace's house at 640 Fifth Avenue continues to function as a center of social activity, hosting the dinners and receptions that mark the seasons and maintain the rituals of their class. The narrator reflects that disinherited from one version of the Vanderbilt story, the narrative where Neely becomes family patriarch, manages railroads, and presides over the dynasty his great-grandfather founded. Neely and Grace write another version, line by line and address by address, invitation by invitation. It is not the story Cornelius Vanderbilt intended when he redirected his fortune, not the punishment he imagined when he used inheritance as a weapon against romantic disobedience. Instead, it becomes a story of resilience and adaptation, of creating meaningful life within constraints that might have crushed people with less determination or fewer resources. The couple has proven that even without the full Vanderbilt inheritance, even with reduced capital and denied family leadership, they can maintain position through social skill, through Grace's relentless entertaining and network building, through Neely's achievements in engineering and military service that establish a reputation independent of family wealth. They have not matched what they might have been with full inheritance, but they have exceeded what many predicted would be possible for a couple beginning married life under a cloud of disinheritance and family disapproval. Yet even successful navigation of social waters cannot prevent the slow erosion of the world they inhabit. The mansions, the formal entertaining, the elaborate machinery of Gilded Age social life, all are beginning to fade, made obsolete by changing economics, shifting cultural values, and the exhaustion that follows global war. Grace's morning ritual of letter writing continues, but the world those letters help maintain is becoming artifact, beautiful, and increasingly irrelevant. In the late 1920s, after nearly 3 decades of estrangement marked by cool formality at best and complete avoidance at worst, there emerged cautious signs of reconciliation between Neely and his mother Alice, now widowed since 1899 and aging into her 70s. Biographical accounts and family histories hint at visits during this period, at softened attitudes produced by time's passage and accumulated losses, though the full details remain private. No dramatic letters of forgiveness survive in archives, no public statements mark the rapprochement, only the quiet resumption of occasional contact after years of breach. The reconciliation, such as it is, comes too late to undo the financial consequences of the 1896 will or to restore Neely to the position he might have occupied as eldest son. But it represents acknowledgement, perhaps, that Alice's absolute opposition to his marriage had been counterproductive, that the punishment imposed through inheritance had not prevented the marriage or destroyed the couple, but had only created permanent division within the family without achieving any positive outcome. Whether she actually regrets her role in the estrangement, whether she comes to accept Grace as daughter-in-law, whether the relationship ever approaches warmth, these questions cannot be answered from surviving evidence. Meanwhile, the larger Vanderbilt fortune fragments under pressures that no will could have anticipated or prevented. The income tax, initially modest when introduced in 1913, increases substantially to fund the war effort and remains high in peacetime, claiming percentages of wealth that earlier generations never faced. Estate taxes similarly claim substantial portions of each generation's inheritance, making it mathematically impossible to preserve vast fortunes intact across multiple successions. The railroad industry itself changes as automotive transport and aviation begin to compete, as government regulation increases, as the strategic advantages the Commodore exploited no longer exist in the same forms. The physical infrastructure of Vanderbilt wealth begins to disappear, mansions are sold, demolished, or converted to other uses as the cost of maintaining them becomes prohibitive and as changing social patterns make such establishments obsolete. The Triple Palace at First West 57th Street, the house where Alice wrote her letters of opposition to Neely's marriage, was demolished in the 1920s. Many of the elaborate Newport cottages are closed, sold, or donated as families consolidate resources and retreat from the expensive social performances that such houses demanded. The Breakers survives, eventually preserved as a museum, but more as a monument to the vanished era than as a functioning family seat. On 1st March 1942, Cornelius Vanderbilt III died of a cerebral hemorrhage aboard his yacht in Miami Beach at age 68. Obituaries note his military service, his engineering patents, his position as oldest son of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, and the complicated inheritance situation that marked his life. His body is returned to New York for burial in the family mausoleum on Staten Island, laid to rest among the Vanderbilts despite the estrangement that defined much of his adult relationship with his parents. Grace, the one suspect bride whose marriage cost her husband tens of millions of dollars, survives him by more than a decade. She continues to maintain social position, to entertain when possible, given wartime restrictions and aging, to write her letters and maintain the connections that have structured her life. She died in 1953, having outlived not only her husband but most of the social world they inhabited, most of the people who had judged their marriage and found it wanting, most of the elaborate machinery of Gilded Age society that had made their love story into scandal. In archives today, Neely's life is often summarized in abbreviated form. Born 1873, eldest son of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, disinherited for marrying Grace Graham Wilson in 1896. Engineer with numerous patents, brigadier general in World War I, died 1942. The compression erases complexity, reduces decades to a few dates and facts, transforms lived experience into data points. But preserved alongside these summary accounts are the letters, the invitations, the carefully folded notes that document the daily reality of their lives. Grace's monogrammed stationery acknowledging gifts, Neely's technical correspondence about locomotive improvements, social registers listing their address and memberships. The narrator reflects that what began as punishment, being written out of the will, excluded from family leadership, denied the inheritance that should have been his, ended in different form of authorship, the chance to define himself through choices rather than through inherited role, to build identity based on what he accomplished and whom he loved rather than on wealth he was born into. The price was real and substantial, tens of millions of dollars. Family relationships damaged perhaps beyond full repair, social position diminished from what it might have been. But the autonomy was real too, the freedom to marry for love rather than family strategy, to pursue engineering innovation rather than merely managing inherited railroads, to become general through service rather than buying honorary titles. Somewhere in a climate-controlled archive, in an institutional repository where the papers of prominent families are preserved for historical research, A box labeled Vanderbilt Family Papers, or perhaps Vanderbilt Cornelius III, holds bundles of cream-colored notepaper, the edges softened by age, the ink fading to brown but still legible. On some sheets, the monogram CV is pressed deep into the paper fibers, the impression surviving long after the hand that created it has turned to dust. On others, the handwriting is unmistakably Grace's, the script looping and confident, the signature that evolved from Grace Graham Wilson to Grace G. Vanderbilt to finally just G.V. as she grew into her married identity. The letters themselves are ordinary by the standards of upper-class correspondence. Thanks for dinner invitations accepted and enjoyed. Regrets for opera evenings that schedule conflicts prevented attending. Notes to charitable organizations acknowledging donations or agreeing to serve on committees. No single sentence explains why a father rewrote his will to redirect a fortune, why a son chose romantic love over tens of millions of dollars, why a family fought with such determination over who belonged at its tables and in its houses. The documents are fragmentary, incomplete, letters saved while others were discarded, correspondences preserved by recipients while the replies were lost, archival selections made by librarians and descendants who could not know what future researchers might want to examine. They provide glimpses rather than comprehensive narrative, moments rather than continuous story. A letter from 1897 mentions difficulties with a house rental. Another from 1904 describes a Newport tea. A note from 1918 thanks someone for congratulations on Neely's military promotion. The gaps between these dated documents are filled with days and years that left no written trace, or whose traces were lost or destroyed. Placed beside earlier documents, the 1896 will that diverted the Vanderbilt fortune from eldest son to younger brother, the marriage certificate from August 1896 that formalized the union despite family opposition, the probate records from 1899 that made the disinheritance public. The personal correspondence seems almost weightless, ephemeral. The legal documents are parchment and witness signatures, formal instruments that redistribute millions and establish binding obligations. The letters are just paper and ink, social niceties exchanged among people whose power to affect each other's lives was limited to invitation and exclusion, to courtesy extended or withheld. Yet it is the paper, not the parchment, that carries the daily work of the lives that were actually lived within the constraints those legal documents established. The will determined how much money Neely would receive, but the letters document how he and Grace used that reduced inheritance to maintain position, to entertain and be entertained, to participate in the social world that gave their existence meaning and structure. The marriage certificate made their union legal, but the correspondence shows how that union functioned across decades, who they knew, where they traveled, what they cared about, how they navigated the complicated social waters of being Vanderbilts who were not quite fully accepted by the Vanderbilt family. The story began, in our opening scene, with a mother folding a letter on the morning of 18th of June, 1896, attempting through written communication and legal maneuvering to prevent a marriage she viewed as disastrous for family interests. It ends here with their letters folded flat in archival boxes, arranged chronologically or alphabetically by archivists who created order from the chaos of accumulated paper. The ink of defiance and the ink of grudging reconciliation, fading at the same slow pace as chemical processes degrade the compounds that once seemed permanent. A researcher opening these boxes today, spreading the letters across an archive reading room table, might try to reconstruct the emotional reality behind the formal language, to read between the conventional phrases for hints of genuine feeling or suppressed resentment. But the letters resist such reading. They are products of a culture that valued controlled expression over authentic emotion, that communicated through indirection and implication, that rarely stated feelings explicitly in written documents that might be preserved and read by others. What can be known is only what the letters explicitly state: dinners attended, gifts acknowledged, obligations discharged. The deeper truth, whether Neely regretted his choice in quiet moments when he calculated what his fortune might have been. whether Grace felt guilt for having cost him so much, whether the love that drove them to marry despite opposition deepened or eroded across decades of navigating consequences, whether Alice ever truly forgave or merely agreed to polite contact in her final years, remains inaccessible, protected by the very protocols of refined communication that the letters exemplify. What endures is not certainty about interior lives, but evidence of choices made and their consequences accepted. The letters exist because the marriage happened, because despite disinheritance, they continued to participate in social life, because Grace performed for decades the ritual of correspondence that maintained their position. The archive preserves not triumph or tragedy, but complexity, the recognition that inheritance and disinheritance, love and duty, family loyalty and personal choice cannot be reduced to simple moral lessons, but remain tangled together in patterns that resist easy interpretation, beautiful and painful and irreducibly human.